Hello, hope everybody's having a good weekend. This week is week 5, and we're going to cover prompting strategies, as well as developing teaching programs. So you were assigned chapter 4 and an article that covered some of these procedures. Now, I think at this point, all of you understand what is meant by prompting. So hopefully this material is not completely new to you, but it'll provide at least an overview of the prompting procedures that we have access to as behavior analysts, depending on our needs. And we'll provide some of the finer details regarding each of these and why we might use them. So as a basic definition, we would say prompts are antecedent stimuli that controls a specific response. So when we're teaching somebody a new skill, we may find ourselves having to use prompts to bring about the correct response. So for some individuals, they may not acquire the response or the chain of behaviors you're trying to teach under traditional teaching conditions. So therefore, we help them. We provide cues or discriminative stimuli to bring about the response that we're looking for. A correct response or a particular form or topography of a response. So there's a variety of different types of prompts: manual, physical, gestured prompts, verbal prompts. We can provide models, photographs, and textual prompts. So these are going to be things we're adding to a situation to bring about a correct response. Now, certainly this is not unique to working with individuals with autism or developmental disabilities. All of us follow prompts as well. I set a reminder on my phone to prompt me to do something that needs to be done at a particular date. We follow schedules. If you follow instructions that have pictures, you learn from the pictures. We may follow models and so forth. So all of this is not unique to teaching individuals with disabilities, but certainly it comes into play quite a bit there. So before talking about the specific prompting procedures, it's worth discussing stimulus control a little bit. And I have a section on stimulus control in a couple weeks. But nevertheless, to sort of set some foundation here, we're going to talk about stimulus control in terms of behavior occurring in the presence of specific stimuli because of a history of reinforcement and so forth. So we could establish stimulus control via differential reinforcement. That is, in the presence of an SD, given a particular response, reinforcement is available. In the presence of an S delta, if the response occurs, no reinforcement. So in a loose example here, when the phone rings, we answer it, there's some reinforcement. When there's no ring, if we were to answer it, there's no reinforcement. So our behavior comes under, the behavior of answering comes under the control of a phone ringing. So if we think about this in the context of teaching individuals who are otherwise having difficulty learning the skill or engaging in the correct behavior under naturalistic conditions, that is, without any help, we may have to enhance these teaching conditions to bring about stimulus control. So for example, if a child's hands are dirty, the dirty hands should occasion hand washing, particularly in the presence of a sink with all these the features associated with hand washing, soap being available and so forth. So each of those stimuli, dirty hands, should occasion going to the restroom to wash hands or a sink. The sink should occasion turning it on, getting your hands wet. The presence of a soap dispenser should occasion these behaviors. So all of these things, these stimuli control responding. But if we're teaching somebody hand washing, or maybe we call it appropriate hand washing, we may learn that those stimuli are not controlling the sequence of behaviors that we want. So we may have to add prompts to bring about the correct response. So when we do add prompts, we have to eventually fade them out, right? Because we don't want the prompt control responding. We want the natural stimuli or contextual stimuli to control the response. So we have to fade these prompts out, and that can be difficult. I'm sure all of you have heard the term prompt dependence. You've taught one of your clients how to do something, but they're dependent on the prompts to do it. And you cannot, or you're having difficulty fading those prompts. So that the idea or the process of prompt fading actually relates to stimulus control, in that we're trying to transfer control from the prompt to the contextually appropriate stimuli or stimulus. So I have an example down here, right, where let's say, for example, we're trying to teach the individual to select the number 2 in the presence of the numbers 1 and 2, right? So you lay out a 1 and 2 on the desk and you say, touch 2. Well, this 2 on the right is the target stimulus, right? That's what you want to control responding. But under your first approach to teaching, when you lay the 1 and 2 out there, the response is not occurring, right? They're getting a lot of incorrect responses. So we may enhance the features of the 2 to hopefully bring about correct responding. Well, in that example there, what we did is we enhanced the stimuli. So we added prompts. We'll talk about these later, specifically what we did to the stimulus. And when we're transferring it, what happens is these enhanced features control the responding, not the target stimulus, the fact that it's 2. So we need to do something in between this enhanced stimulus, these prompts, the stimulus with prompts added to it, and the target stimulus. And that's called prompt fading, or transfer of stimulus control. And there are a couple two broad categories of transfer of stimulus control procedures. The first one is stimulus prompt procedures. So again, we're talking about prompting, but in this case, we are adding stimuli or enhancements to what I'm going to call the relevant stimulus features. So thinking back to that last example, if you want to teach discrimination between the numbers 1 and 2, and that you want the features of the 2 to control responding, if they're not initially, we enhance them in some way. Those enhancements may control the responding during our initial teaching trials, but we need to transfer them. So we need to gradually remove these enhancements. So think of it in terms of the person is not learning under what we might call traditional instruction, right? Here's the 2 numbers, point to that. We might even model, and maybe it still doesn't control responding. So then we're going to enhance the teaching methods by adding prompts. And those prompts will initially control responding. And our goal then is to fade them out such that the teaching materials control responding. The other approach would be response prompt procedures. So these are procedures that are not related to the task. So in my example of teaching a discrimination between the numbers 1 and 2, instead of enhancing the number 2, we could point to the number 2, or we could use hand-over-hand guidance to bring about the correct response, physically guide the person to point to the number 2. Those are response prompt procedures. So we're prompting a response. We're not adding prompts or enhancements to the stimuli. Okay, so let's go over each of these prompting methods. So the first one that's laid out in the textbook or in the chapter is verbal prompts. So these are just simply words or instructions or questions that direct the person to engage in the correct response. So when you're initially teaching a child how to speak or identify a dog, and in the presence of a dog, you may have learned this in verbal behavior. In the presence of a dog, you're trying to teach the child to say dog. And you say, what is that? And they're not producing the correct response. You may begin by prompting, by saying duh, duh. So you're providing a cue that the word is dog. And if the child says dog, you say, great job, that's a dog. Eventually, you would hope that you could fade those prompts out, that they're no longer needed. And that may be need to be systematic, and we'll talk about that. So obviously, verbal prompts are probably the most common, right? And it could be anything from, in the example I provided, teaching discrimination between 1 and 2, we may say touch 2. If the child doesn't respond, we may repeat the instruction. Now, that's not necessarily a prompt that it may occasion the correct response, and it could be a prompt, but it's really just repeating the instruction. So I think a better example would be if somebody were to give your client a toy, and you prompt them or you provide the instruction, say thank you. The say is sort of the verbal instruction. Do this, right? The thank you is a model. You're providing the model. Say thank you. And those prompts, you may even continue those prompts. If the child's not saying thank you or having difficulty, you may help them by saying the, thank. And hopefully it occasions the full response of thank you. So you have to fade that model out over time because, again, you want the child's response of saying thank you to be under the control of the appropriate stimulus or stimulus context. In this case, of somebody giving them something that they asked for, perhaps. So modeling is one way to generate new behavior or teach new behaviors. And this is basically an antecedent stimulus that evokes an imitative response. So the child has to be able to imitate. That needs to be part of their repertoire. If it's not, we need to teach imitation. And again, thinking beyond just individuals with autism and developmental disabilities, a lot of us learn through imitation. You imitate the behaviors of other people, or the way somebody presents, or what your BCBA supervisor is doing. They model it for you and you imitate it, and eventually it becomes part of your behavioral repertoire to where it's no longer an imitation because it's occurring outside of the model context. So the model is going to be the antecedent stimulus that evokes an imitative response. And there can be a variety of ways to present the model, right? It can be live, your BCBA saying, here's how we provide the prompt, right? Or it can be via video. You could watch the video, and it may be a BCBA providing a prompt, hand-over-hand guidance, for example. So you learn through the model. So models are going to be most effective when there's similarity between the learner and the model. The research sort of bears this out, that if you're using a prompting procedure, or a modeling procedure such as video modeling, often you get better results when the model is a peer. In fact, I'm not sure what the data show about this at this point, but you can generate the behavior in the actual student and record them engaging in the behavior. And that may even be more effective, seeing themselves do the behavior. So obviously through clever video editing and so forth, you can get the full sequence of behaviors recorded. Maybe you're using prompting to do that, but you cut the prompting out so the student is only seeing the model of themselves doing the full behavior. So modeling is very effective, and you'll probably see a lot of literature on video modeling, particularly with teaching individuals with autism. So again, the individual has to be able to imitate a model for things to be effective. So the model stimulus is presented to evoke the imitative response. The imitative response has to immediately follow the model. And that's where you have this sort of, you know that the person has an imitative repertoire. But again, if that doesn't exist, you need to generate imitation or teach generalized imitation. So fortunately, we can teach imitation or generalized imitation. This is basically, we're trying to generate a repertoire of whenever a model is presented, the individual imitates it. So generalized imitation occurs in the presence of a variety of models. So imitation of a response of a model without previous reinforcement of imitation for that specific response. So we have to, for some individuals who don't have imitation in their repertoire, we have to train this or teach it. And the general steps, without getting into the weeds on this, would be you want to select some models and repeat them, present them like one through three models, something to that effect. So you present the model to the learner, and then you record whether they imitate correct or incorrectly. Once performance criterion is met, you add a new model. So this is essentially, if they're not imitating, you're providing these small foundational model imitation trials. And when they do them correctly, you move on, you add another model. And eventually what you hope to produce is this generalized imitation that you will eventually, perhaps after 10 models, the person just starts without any help. They just start imitating the new model you present. Okay. So again, you obviously here you would have to use physical guidance if the person's not following the model, and fade those prompts as quickly as you possibly can. And then you want to conduct your generalization probes to see if when I initiate a new model, does the person imitate that without any help or physical guidance? Okay, so from modeling, we can move on and talk about manual or gestural prompts or gestured prompts. So as you might imagine from the term, a manual prompt is going to include some form of physical guidance to generate the appropriate response. This could be hand-over-hand guidance, and this would be sort of a typical term we would use, that you want the individual to, for example, turn on the faucet to get their hands wet during hand washing. You may lightly grab their hand, move it toward the faucet or the faucet, and turn the handle to get the water to come out. So you're manually guiding them to emit the correct behavior. And we may do a variety of things to fade that manual guidance. So we could move from hand over hand guidance to maybe just touching the elbow or gently touching the elbow, pushing the hand toward the faucet. So these are just manual guidance to bring about the correct response. Gesture prompts is sort of, as you might imagine, you're gesturing the expected behavior. So if I were to, again, be teaching hand washing and I wanted the individual to turn on the water, and I wasn't using hand over hand guidance, I may, rather than do a full model, turn it on like this and actually twist the handle to have the water come out. I might simply put my hand in that vicinity and maybe make a slight twist of motion. So it's sort of like an approximation to a model, because you're just trying to use the least amount of guidance necessary to bring about the correct response. And gesture prompts can take a variety of forms. Pointing is a gesture prompt. Motioning, like I mentioned with the example. Nodding, yes, that's correct. So we're simply, again, using sort of the least amount of guidance necessary to bring about the correct response. Photographs can also be very effective prompts. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we probably use these in various ways if we're maybe trying to learn a new skill. If we have a hobby, at gymnastics or playing a musical instrument, photographs can be helpful in getting a correct form of a particular skill or behavior. When working with individuals, you may have already encountered or maybe even created photo schedules for the individual. And the idea here is we will teach them to follow the photo schedule. So the photos are providing prompts. Now, interestingly enough, and the text sort of gets into this in terms of teaching individuals how to follow a picture schedule, we may have to use physical guidance to walk them over to the picture schedule, acknowledge or at least sort of direct themselves to the first step in the photo schedule, and then maybe even model doing it or physically guide them to do it. So if this were the schedule, we might meet with the individual in the beginning of the day. We walk them over to their chore chart and we point or guide them to point to sweep. And maybe we add the verbal instruction sweep. Then we physically guide them over to a broom and physically guide them to start sweeping. Now, that is using physical guidance to teach the entire chain of behaviors. And we have to eventually fade those prompts out such that only the photograph is generating the correct behavior. So what that may look like is we walk the person over to the chore chart, and instead of physically guiding them to point to the first chore, we may say point. And if they don't do it, then maybe we motion toward the first picture, in this case sweeping. And then again, maybe through our teaching and prompting over the past couple of weeks, they've learned to sweep. And the ultimate goal would be that they independently come over to look at their chore chart, sweep, and so forth. So one of the things that's interesting about these photographic schedules is we want the photograph to generate the correct response or the correct task to do. So what's interesting is if we use various procedures, prompting procedures like physical guidance to teach the individual to follow the chore chart, can we replace any of these pictures maybe with a skill that they know how to do, right? So let's just say they know how to make a sandwich, and then we put it right here in place of vacuuming. Will they get to that picture and then make the sandwich, right? So we want to make sure that they're actually following, the schedules are prompting the correct behaviors. So going back, there's a variety of things you could do with photographic schedules and picture prompts. So it doesn't have to be a schedule. If there's a task that the individual has to do, like build, put together a folder with some specific papers in there, we could teach them to, select each of the materials via photographic schedule or prompt schedule, and then have them complete a particular task. Textual prompts are also useful. So as you might imagine, these are simply text, written cues, right? These are things that you and I use, that I'm going to write this note to remind me that I need to pick up a grocery on the way home from work. Other types of textual prompts are in the form of what we call scripts or script fading. So this is, again, a whole area of research, particularly with individuals that are diagnosed with autism or just have trouble generating vocal interactions. So we could utilize scripts, written literal sentences or phrases, and we teach the person to read the script. So for example, hello, how are you today, is written on an index card. And we teach the person to read that. Now we send them over to the other therapist because the student typically doesn't engage in this vocal response. And we prompt them to go over there and read the script in the presence of the secondary therapist. Then we want to go through this process of fading the script. There are a variety of ways you could do that. You could just simply remove different words. Or I think I've read some papers where they literally cut the script, right? So we may cut it off from the ending here until the individual can recite the script without using the actual script, right? So it's a fading procedure, script fading. Now, of course, the person would have to be able to read to utilize scripts, but there are other methods. If we and I think this was on a previous slide, video modeling could be, we could have a script in a video, we could have an audio script, right? For somebody who cannot read, we may record the script, right? Hello, how are you today? and the individual has a little handheld recorder. They walk over to the therapist, we play the script for them, and they repeat the script. And then, of course, we could fade the script in a variety of ways. If it's recorded, we could actually decrease the volume over consecutive successful trials. Tactile prompts have also showed up in the literature, not only to bring about a particular response, but it's been used in self-monitoring, a variety of other sort of intervention procedures. So here we would have, I think the most common form of a tactile prompt is a vibrating prompt. And one way or one device that can do that, there's a couple of them out there. The one I'm most familiar with is called the Motivator. And the idea with this little device is we could set it according to specific intervals. For example, 10-minute intervals or 30 minutes or hours. And the device will vibrate on the interval. So if, let's just say, well, in this example, paced eating. Let's say an individual eats too rapidly. We can, probably through the use of other prompts like physical guidance, get them to sort of keep their hand on this motivator device, and when the vibration occurs, when the interval times out, they reach for their fork, scoop up food, take a bite, put their fork down, put their hand back on the device, and wait for the vibration again, and then repeat it. So we can actually pace their eating by providing prompts that it's now time to take a bite. Again, obviously there's other procedures in here like physical guidance and so forth. Or let's just say we're trying to generate independent communication between two peers. And it doesn't need to be complex vocalizations. Let's just say we're trying to teach a client to say hello to his or her little brother or sister. We could set the motivator for, let's just say, an hour or 30 minutes intervals. Or we probably want to start out with more shorter duration intervals. So let's say 10-minute intervals. And at 10 minutes, the individual has their hand on the timer, the motivator, the vibration goes off. We physically guide them to walk over to their brother and sister and read a script that says hello, right? Then they come back. So eventually what happens is if this vibrating interval controls responding, the therapist doesn't have to be there. Every time the timer goes off, the client will walk over to their little brother or sister and say hello, or do any other behavior that we teach. So there's a lot we could do here. In fact, the way I've used these has been for staff, that you set it and they have to provide reinforcement, or they have to collect a piece of data or something like that. So motivators are very effective tactile prompts, right? It's signaling via a feeling, the vibration in this case, that something should happen, right? So as I mentioned, it's used in self-monitoring as well. If you're trying to teach anybody, let's just say a regular individual who engages in nail biting, typically developing individual who engages in nail biting, let's say they do it with such high frequency, you set the motivator for, let's just say a minute to start. Well, let's say 5 minutes. I'll change it up. And every 5 minutes, when it vibrates, they self-assess. Am I nail biting? And if they are, they could record it on a data sheet. If they aren't, they could record it on the data sheet. And we could provide contingencies for not nail biting. So very useful and very effective. Okay, so a variety of different prompting procedures we looked at there. Now, two very common procedures fall under a category referred to as a prompt hierarchy. Here we are using a sequence of prompts in our teaching, and we're going to use each of these in very specific contexts. So those two procedures are referred to as most to least prompting and it's often used to teach new skills. So these are skills that are not necessarily in the individual's repertoire. It's also what we would refer to as an errorless learning procedure, because the early prompts in this sequence are going to always result in the correct response, right? Whatever we're trying to teach. So, for example, in the hand washing situation, if I want the individual to turn on the water, I could use most to least prompting to teach that particular step in maybe a more complete task analysis. So it starts out with a physical prompt. So each time I have a teaching session of hand washing that maybe consists of, I'm going to simplify this and say 10 steps in a task analysis. Whenever I get to the step where the individual has to turn on the water, I provide physical guidance. And I'm going to do that for some number of teaching sessions, just to ensure that there's a sufficient number of opportunities where the individual is physically guided and thus learning to emit this correct response. Then I'm going to move to a gesture prompt. So instead of, let's say I get through 5 teaching sessions where I physically guide the person to complete step 5, turning on the water. Then in the next teaching session, I want to fade that physical prompt. So I'm not going to use that. I'm going to gesture, make a motion to turn on the water. And if the response occurs, then I'm going to stick with that for a little while, the gesture prompt. After so many teaching sessions, then I'm going to fade to a verbal prompt, turn on the water. So, and obviously the verbal is probably always there, right? So when I'm physically guiding, I'm still probably saying turn on the water. When I'm gesturing, I'm probably saying turn on the water. So the idea here is we're teaching a new skill. We're going to do it in a way that during the early teaching, there's no errors being made. So the person always sort of contacts either the natural consequence of the water turning on, or maybe we add in some form of reinforcement. And then we're going to move to less invasive responses, or less invasive prompts rather. So that's most to least. The next hierarchy is least to most. This is the opposite. This is often used to maintain acquired skills, or in instances where you believe the individual has the response in their repertoire, but for whatever reason, they're not emitting it. Maybe there's an issue with compliance to an instruction. So least to most is sometimes referred to as 3-step guided compliance. And here, we're going to provide the verbal prompt first. Turn on the water. If the individual doesn't turn on the water, often we will provide a repeat of the instruction. Turn on the water. If they don't do it then, we move to the gesture. Again, always providing the verbal, turn on the water, and I'm gesturing how to do that. If they still don't respond, then I'm going to use hand over hand physical guidance to have them turn on the water. So in this case, this is more of a sequence where you're starting with the less invasive response, waiting a couple seconds, and there's no specified time, but let's just say we go 5 seconds before moving to the next prompt. If the response doesn't occur after the verbal, we repeat it. If it doesn't occur then, we move to the gesture. If it doesn't occur then, we move to physical. Now again, as I have noted here, the second verbal is not always provided. Some people will just go verbal, gesture, physical. So keep that in mind. The difference here is, imagine yourself working with a client who happens to be non-compliant to the instruction of turn on the water. So you're giving them the chance to respond independently twice, and then if they don't, you're physically guiding them, so they're not going to be able to escape doing what you're asking them to do. So 3-step occasionally is almost incorporated as a procedural way of providing instruction. So when I worked at Bancroft NeuroHealth as well as the Kennedy Krieger Institute, this was just par for the course that whenever we delivered an instruction, if the client did not follow through, we went through this prompting sequence. So it's a way to sort of generate independence or compliance. Whereas this most to least is we're literally trying to teach something that's not in the repertoire. Okay, so hopefully that distinction is clear. Another prompting procedure, which sort of is very similar to the most to least, is, I would say it is most to least prompting, but it's referred to as graduated guidance, right? So here again, the therapist is going to manually prompt the behavior or a behavior chain and gradually fade prompts. The way the prompts are faded in graduated guidance is obviously in steps, but imagine if we're physically guiding the individual to turn on the water, so hand over hand, right? The full physical. Then, after some consecutive successful trials, and they're all going to be successful because we're fully physically guiding the person, during this teaching this chain of behaviors, we might move to just touching the wrist or elbow, again, gently moving the person in the direction of the correct response. So we go from that to light physical shadowing, right? So sometimes we may need to do this, that if we've had a history of physically guiding an appropriate response and we're trying to fade it out, sometimes we may have to actually have our hand sort of in proximity, or what we call shadowing, the client's hand, because us being there is stimulus control for the response. So again, we move from shadowing maybe to proximity of the therapist. Initially, I'm right there. Then I maybe step back a couple feet. Then hopefully I could fade myself out altogether. So often you'll see inscriptions of teaching the individuals to use photographic schedules, or sometimes these schedules are on an iPad or an iPhone, that they're taught using graduated guidance. And this is, again, just sort of adding assistance where necessary, but being sure you have a process for fading out the guidance. So most of those, if not all, I think fall under the category of response prompts, right? So we're kind of bringing about a response, and we're adding prompts that are not necessarily part of the teaching stimuli. So when we move to stimulus prompts, stimulus fading is one of the examples that the textbook talks about. So and this is one of the things I was describing in the early discussion of transfer of stimulus control. So say, for example, we are trying to teach discrimination between the letters A and B, and the target stimuli, the actual stimuli we are using, look like what you see here on the screen, A and B, right? So say, for example, that's on an index card or a touchscreen computer. So we start there, and we're alternating the position of A and B on each trial. So we're presenting these trials, and we learn through our baseline that the individual cannot select A in this arrangement. We're saying select A. They sometimes they hit A, sometimes they miss and hit B. So therefore, we need to prompt the correct response or do something to the stimuli to occasion the correct response. So one thing we could do is enhance the features of the letter A, right? And what we're doing there is increasing the discrepancy between the two stimuli in the target, right? So the letter A and B now are very discrepant because B is standard font. It's black and it's typical size, whatever the target size of our teaching stimuli is set for. The A is being enhanced in that we're adding a color to it and we're increasing it in size. The goal of doing that is to make the features so salient and so discrepant from the other stimulus, in this case B, that it occasions a correct response, that when I say A, the individual touches the newly enhanced A. So let's just say I run through 30 trials of this. So now I'm alternating the position, A and B, and the individual meets 90% correct responding under these conditions. In my fading steps, I need to reduce these enhancements. So let's just say I sort of shrink the A down. Maybe I can adjust the color in some way, but here it looks like I just shrunk it down. So step 2 is now I'm going to teach trials under this arrangement. Let's just say I go through another 30 trials and responding to A is still maintained at 90% or greater. Then I go back to my target, right? And if responding maintains, then the discrimination is taught and I can move on to something else. If it's not, I might have to backtrack and add my enhancements again, right? So this is a process where we're moving from a target. If learning is not occurring under those targeted conditions, we enhance the stimulus feature. So we're adding a stimulus prompt. And then, of course, we're trying to minimize those enhancements over time, getting back to the target. So hopefully that makes sense. Another stimulus prompt procedure is known as stimulus shaping. Here, we're actually going to manipulate the topography of the teaching material. So this would be something that if you're teaching things like letters, numbers, words, you might utilize stimulus shaping. I think all of us probably have had some exposure to this as young adolescents or toddlers herself, where the letter S is shaped like a snake, things of that nature. So here, we're going to manipulate the topography of the teaching material. So if we want the word boy to occasion the client saying boy, right, essentially reading, what we might do is go down here to what I have step 4, where and this is not my art. I cannot draw even this well. So this obviously looks like a boy. So let's just say the client, they cannot read this. So you do this and you say, what is that? And they say a boy. Then after so many trials of that, let's just say we go through 10 trials and every one they get correct. That's a boy. Then we minimize or remove these enhancements. And now you have this. So now if you notice, you have the features of the letters, right? So it's sort of a prompt. Let's just say 10 trials correct. We move to this, right? 10 trials correct. Now we get here. So stimulus shaping. I remember years ago, my daughter used to watch a show, Word World, and I encourage you to look it up. Basically, it has all these characters like a dog or a cat, and the animal is shaped in a word. So it sort of should help or prompt correct reading. Obviously, you have to be an artist to utilize this. Okay, so prompt delay is a procedure that we incorporate in other prompting procedures. It is not the same delay as we discussed when we talked about something like most to least or least to most prompting, where we deliver a prompt or an instruction like turn on the water and we wait a couple seconds for the person to comply before moving on to the next prompt in the sequence. This is something a little different, where we're going to incorporate, typically done with an extra stimulus prompt, so a physical prompt, like guidance or point prompt or something of that nature, and we're going to incorporate it into other prompting procedures. Often you see it used in a sense where we insert a delay between the target stimulus or stimuli presentation and an extra stimulus prompt. So imagine this example where I provide the letters A and B on index cards, and I say touch A. And I'm waiting for the person to touch A. So if they don't touch A, or they're getting things incorrect, what I could do is a prompt delay procedure. So on initial trials, what I'm going to do is present my cards, A and B. I'm going to say touch A, and I'm going to point to A, again, to prompt the correct response. So you do it. So let's just say I go through 10 trials of doing that. Put out the cards, touch A, and I point. Put out the cards, touch A, and I point to A. After so many trials of that, it's going to be 100% correct because I'm prompting the correct response. Then I'm going to insert a delay, and I'm going to start with a short delay. So now I lay out my cards, A and B. I say touch A. I wait, let's just say I wait 2 seconds. If no response occurs, then I provide the prompt. Right? Then after, if responding occurs before the 2 seconds, then I could sort of increase my delay. So the idea here is we want to arrange reinforcement to favor responses that occur before the prompt. Right? So initially the delay is short, then I increase the delay to where hopefully the person will respond before the prompt because they can maximize reinforcement for doing so. Think of it this way. If I'm running 10 trials and I have a prompt delay of 10 seconds, I provide the letter A and B. I say touch A. 10 seconds elapses and the person's waiting for me to prompt them. So I prompt, then they emit the correct response, and maybe there's reinforcement. Well, it's actually more advantageous for them to respond before the prompt because they'll access reinforcement more quickly. So that's sort of how this prompt delay works. The thing I want you to keep in mind is the initial use of it is often the prompt is delivered immediately on initial trials, and then it is the delay is inserted on subsequent trials, right? 'Cause we're initially prompting, and then we're delaying the onset of the prompt in an attempt to transfer stimulus control. Another important thing to note when we're utilizing prompting is there's always a risk of generating what's referred to as prompt dependence. This means the student's response, whatever it is, simple discrimination response, A, B, to more complex chains of behavior, becomes dependent on the prompts as opposed to the natural cues that should control responding. So in my simplified example, touch A, given A, B, the cue that should control responding should be the presence of the stimuli, A and B, and me saying touch A. That should control responding. But if we're utilizing prompting, we may run into a situation where the prompts actually control responding. And of course, we need to fade. So we got to be very careful when we're utilizing prompting and what type of prompting we're using. We want to make sure that we fade prompts as quickly as possible so we don't generate prompt dependence. Sometimes you'll see in instructions, for example, if anybody's familiar with the picture exchange communication program, there's actually a curriculum for how to teach picture card use, picture card communication use, and they recommend using a second therapist to prompt. Consider this, that you are the therapist providing the instructions. So let's just say it's 2 pictures, cat and dog, and you say touch cat. And you're utilizing a prompt where you point to the cat, or maybe you physically guide the person's hand to touch cat. You say, good job touching cat. And you go through trials. You could generate prompt dependence. An alternative method of prompting might be, if you have the resources, to have a second therapist behind the person physically guiding them. So you kind of don't have this big salient stimulus of a person physically guiding the correct response. So the features of the prompt are actually minimized in some way. So something to think about. So obviously, again, we need to fade these prompts out. We want to do it as quickly as possible, but we have to do it systematically. So often you'll see in the literature prompt fading being done contingent on correct responding. So I think in most of the examples I provided and most of the examples where you might see prompting used, we're trying to generate either a single correct response or an independent response. Well, let's talk about those interchangeably for now. They may be different, but we're trying to teach a behavior, and that behavior has a correct form, so it can be correct. Or we're trying to teach a response to occur independent of any prompting, so independent. But for now, we'll keep those two terms interchangeable. So we got to fade the prompts contingent on correct responding. Now, if we're starting with physical prompting, such as a most to least procedure, initially responding is going to be correct all the time. So the systematic part needs to be, all right, let's go 3 consecutive sessions of 10 trials where we utilize the physical prompt. Then we'll fade to a gesture prompt, or we'll fade proximity or use shadowing instead of hand-over-hand guidance. So we have a procedure where we are fading the prompts based on X amount of correct responding for X amount of sessions. In this example, let's just say I'm using 80% correct responding for 3 consecutive sessions, or 80% or more, right? Correct responding. You could always reintroduce prompts if responding deteriorates during your fading process. And you always need to be prepared to reinforce unprompted responses, right? Because that is the ultimate goal. We don't want to use prompting. So if it occurs during your prompt fading, obviously jump in there and provide as much reinforcement as you can. So let's take a look at some response prompting procedures. Okay, that is it for the section on prompting. Hopefully you better understand some of the prompting procedures that we have available to us and the importance of fading those prompts as we are moving through our teaching procedures.